Welcome to another in a series of NJAPM webinars. I'm Carl Cangelosi, and today's presentation is on divorce and pet-related issues, mediation tips and techniques. We have three panelists today. Lawrence Jones is a mediator, arbitrator, and professor at Montclair University and Monmouth University. He's a former family part superior court judge and has presided over pet-related disputes in family court. Steve Menack is the founding president of the New Jersey Association of Professional Mediators, vice president of the Professional Mediation Board of Standards, and a founding member of the board of directors of the Academy of Professional Family Mediators. Ken Neumann is a founding board member of the Academy of Professional Family Mediators and is a founder and director of the Center for Mediation and Training. He's trained as a family therapist and clinical school psychologist. So welcome. I thought I would open with a few thoughts that I had, which is I saw in the paper recently that someone spent $40,000 for heart surgery on their dog. And that got me thinking about the fact that when you go into the supermarket, a whole aisle is devoted to different types of cat food, different types of dog food and related things. And they have whole standalone stores dedicated to just pets. And then I thought back to my childhood, which was a long time ago. And I think there were like one type of canned food, a few types of canned food, a few types of dry food, and not much else. And if you ever said to your parents, you know, Fido is really sick and it's going to cost $300 to fix Fido, they would say, well, what should we name our next dog? It just wasn't done that people spent that kind of money on pets. So let me throw out to you, the panelists, what's changed here and how does that relate to what we see, what's going on in the courts and the issues in mediation? Ken, why don't you start?
Thanks. I think what I noticed growing up, our first dog, as my sister remembers, was named Sparky. And then I got a dog named Watson. And then we had a dog named Sherlock. All of a sudden, my kids' first dogs were named Peter and Molly. We started to humanize our pets by giving them people's names. And I saw that happening. I grew up, that wasn't the case. Now, very few pets don't have, some do, human names. That's part of it. When you call out Peter, you could be calling for your brother or you could be calling for your dog. You don't know the difference. We've humanized pets tremendously. That's
actually a good thing in so many ways, because pets, particularly, we're talking mostly dogs and cats, although there are other pets, obviously, but they become part of the family. They do. With the emotional bonds, sometimes are irreplaceable. Sometimes someone's best, they say, man's best friend is a dog, right? Or it could be a cat, or it could be, you know, any type of animal. But there's a truth in that. Nationally, May was National Pet Month. We didn't have National Pet Month 20 years ago.
Thanks, Larry. I didn't know that. Good
yeah, in fact, this webinar was originally scheduled for May, but we bumped it into June. So we're still celebrating the National Pet Month. But it's there's legislation on animals, also on the federal and state level. We could talk about that a little bit. But it's for lots of families, it's serious business. It means a lot. And so from a mediation standpoint, anyone who does family mediation may find themselves at some point in the future having to confront these issues and deal with these issues and try to help families resolve them. And however you personally feel about pets really is irrelevant. It's how the parties feel about their pet. There's, in many instances, the pet can be like a child to them. I'm sure Ken and Steve, you've seen this in other cases, right?
Especially when there aren't children of the marriage, the pets often take on the role of the child, and can be one of the most contentious issues between the spouses. So absolutely, this is something that we're seeing increasingly. We've been seeing for a long time.
And you know, even in intact families, particularly as people start to get a little older, You start seeing there's a whole cottage industry now for like estate planning regarding pets. Pet trusts becomes a big thing now. If you want to leave money in your estate to have your pet taken care of in the event your pet survives you. It was the famous Leona Hemsley case in New York where she left $12 million to her dog, and suddenly everyone wanted to own that dog, you know. But it's become an important part of for planning for seniors, for those who do elder law as well. So it's serious stuff, and there's a tremendous and growing relevance to it, which we should all be familiar with.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we start into the discussing the topics that have been listed on the notice, let me remind people that if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be able to see those, and everyone else will be able to see those as well. So please use that when you're going to ask a question. So first, let's a discussion on the status of the law on pet disputes in New Jersey and emerging in sister states. And Larry, why don't you address that?
Okay, yeah, I'll just try to give a very brief overview, because whether you're an attorney or you're not an attorney, if you're mediating, when issues come up, it's important to have some degree of background in terms of what the status of the law is. So traditionally in New Jersey, we'll start with New Jersey, pets were considered property. No different than a lamp or a typewriter or cash in the bank or anything else. There was no special analysis done for pets than there would be for anything else, just property. So if an animal got injured, for example, it's as if someone injured your property, as if not as if, you know, they injured your child or anything along those lines. So, but there started to become a growing recognition of the special nature of certain animals. So a couple of cases are out there, some reported opinions, which you can always look up, which have some relevance. Probably the most famous in New Jersey is called Hausman versus Dare. That's an appellate division case from 2009, where there's a dispute between two people over possession of a dog, quote, custody of a dog. And while the court didn't go so far as to determine you have custody disputes over a dog in the same way that you would a child, it was noted specifically. The court noted that pets often have special subjective value to the owner, subjective value. So it's different right off the bat than a lamp may be, or a typewriter may be, or any other piece of property. Hausman case cited to a prior case called Hyland versus Boras. That was a 1998 appellate division case. Hyland is with a Y, Hyland versus Boras, where an owner of an injured dog was entitled to recover costs for treatment exceeding the replacement value. Again, treating the dog as something beyond mere property. So while neither of these cases stand for the proposition that you do a custody evaluation or a best interest analysis on a dog, it started opening the avenues for there to be some growth in this area. In New Jersey, the domestic violence statute was amended in 2012 to specifically allow two sections, section 26 and 27, for situations when an abused person has a pet. And what happens to the pet, or if they both own a pet, that it's a presumption that custody or possession of the pet goes to the non-abused party, the victim, even if the dog was or cat was titled in the other person's name. That's on a temporary basis, but still it's to essentially encourage people to seek restraining orders and not avoid doing so merely because they're afraid of what's going to happen to their pet. On the federal level, after Hurricane Katrina in 2006, many of you may remember in Louisiana, many people would not leave their homes despite the flood because they didn't want to leave their dogs behind. They didn't want to leave their cats behind. They sat on their roofs rather than leave their animals. And the outcry of that was so substantial that a federal legislation was passed called the Pets Act, which basically indicates that a Pet Evacuation and Transportation Act, which indicates that any state who's seeking federal funds has to provide in their state evacuation plans for disasters accountability or what's going to happen with the pets, which of course in New Jersey became a real issue because 6 years after Katrina, we had Hurricane Sandy, and the exact same thing did happen, but there was some planning involved there. We've attached in the materials, you can download them. There's a statute in terms of what's going on in other states. Both Alaska and Illinois have started the process of basically having animal issues become be available for consideration by judges, by family court judges. California has just recently become the third state to do so. And so the tendency is to feel, you never know for certain, that New Jersey being a very progressive state, that it won't be too long before New Jersey starts following in those footsteps as well, and really opens the door at least a little bit more to having judges decide these issues in some way besides simply who is the owner of the property, as you would with a lamp or something else. So the bottom line, Carl, is the status of the law. It is slowly progressing towards somewhere new, where it was something much different than it would have been, say, 10 or 20 years ago, both on a state and federal level.
And that reflects, I guess, what we were talking about earlier, the trend, the increased position of pets in the lives of people, right? Yeah. They're much more valuable. In a sense, they're no longer just a pet. They're now an additional family member of a sort.
That's true. It's very true. And again, we're talking primarily about mediation today. So the thing to keep in mind is that, you know, these laws didn't come about just out of the blue, or some legislators or judges decided, well, let's start changing things. It was in response to a demand. It was in response to the fact that people wanted to treat their animals as something more than personal property. So when you're mediating and you have two people come in and they have a dispute over a dog or a cat, it is serious to them. It is sometimes it's critical to them. Sometimes it could be the most important living friend in their lives. You know, some people say they got their best relationships are not with other people, but with their dogs. Because why? Because unconditional love, they don't hold grudges, all that kind of stuff, you know. And there's something to be said for that, perhaps. But if you as a mediator are sitting down with people in that position, you have to be prepared to treat it with the utmost respect and dignity as they would want it to be done, because otherwise you're starting right off on the wrong track.
Okay. Now let's turn to possession versus custody of pets following a separation or divorce. Ken, what do you see as the difference here?
Well, I mean, I think what Larry's saying, it's not, I mean, the word custody is, of course, a little tough to use, but it really comes down to that. I differentiate very much between, and we talked about this earlier, the situation where people have children and people don't have children. When people have children, particularly younger children, we'll say dog, more typically, will go back and forth with the children on whatever schedule the parents agree to. So we're going to say that the pet, Peter, you know, will in fact go with the children. Now, of course, if someone goes away with the kids and they're not taking the dog, the other parent has first right of refusal, which we'll talk about later. But I think that when people have children, the pet will tend to go with the children. And I assume that's most people's experience. When people don't have children, of course, the pet becomes their child on some way. In fact, it's fairly well known. I don't know if it's well known, but I know it, that people, before they have a child, often get a dog to practice to see how well they can do with that. So, I mean, in fact, it's a pre-child or something of the sort. Yeah. And so, but when people don't have children, then there's a lot of contention, and we'll talk more about that. But I do differentiate between the two situations, in fact, quite a lot. And people have schedules. When they don't have children, they have schedules. I had one situation where the husband is going to keep a house up in the country, and that when he went up to the country on the weekends, the wife wanted, and they had no children, the wife wanted him to take the dog up to the country because the dog loved being in the country rather than the apartment in the city. So those things, yeah, that was a real situation. I can remember it very well. Yeah, that people have the care and concern. Yes, our kids love the country. Our dog loves the country. It almost becomes the same when you have the discussion. Yeah.
So Ken, when you're drafting a memorandum of understanding, where would you put the provisions about the pet? Would you put that under the parenting plan section?
I have a separate section for pets.
You do.
And I named the pet. The dog named Peter we will deal with the dog named Peter in the following ways, you know, and then say whatever it is.
Okay, that was a question submitted.
It's a separate section on pets.
Right. And that's actually a very good way of gauging the importance that the pet has, because when I go over with the couple what the situation is. And I mentioned pets. Sometimes people don't even think of pets. And if they do, and I ask, what are the pets' names? Some people respond positively and say, oh, yeah, it's, and give me the pets' names. Other people say, do we really need to specify that? And that is a good indicator or weather vane of what may lie ahead with respect to the extent to which the pet's going to be a serious contentious issue between the couple or not. That's one of my earliest indications in mediation.
If I could ask Ken and Steve, do you ever have a situation when there are, for example, 2 dogs? And there's a tendency from, let's say if it's a mediator who's really is not that involved with animals. From a mediator standpoint, to simply say, well, how about if you each take 1 dog? But couldn't that potentially backfire if you say it in that fashion, as if you're insensitive to the fact that you're breaking up siblings or a canine couple in some fashion? Couldn't you lose credibility with your own clients if you approach it in that fashion?
Yeah, that's one reason why, rather than asking the question that way, I might ask them, have the 2 of you discussed what the arrangements will be regarding Peter or regarding Max, and let them lead in with it. And that also gives a further indication of where the issues are, and also whether they've come to decisions with respect to the pet on their own, or whether they say, gee, we don't know what typically happens. You'll get a better gauge of how far along the parties are in their decision-making regarding the arrangements, without making it appear either that the mediator is insensitive, or that the mediator might be coming from a different bent than the spouses are.
I think that's a good question, Larry. And of course, we all learn how to ask questions in a more open-ended way rather than come across with a bias or insensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, in direct response to that question, most times and people often have 2 pets, two small dogs that they got at the same time, often or not, even if not, they most often say the dogs should go together. There's generally that feeling. Everyone's shaking their head. Yeah, there's generally that feeling. The same way you wouldn't say, one person gets 1 dog, 1 person gets 1 kid. It almost becomes equivalent.
Even if they're not, even if they're not from the same species. I remember we used to go up to the Poconos, and they had up there an abandoned animal farm, basically. So we'd stop in there every now and then. And we'd go there once a year, and there was a wolf and a bear. And they were together in the same thing, and they were best friends, this wolf and the bear. And the wolf died of cancer ultimately. And the bear was alone, and the bear was literally grieving for the wolf. And the owners would say, this is what's going on. He was heartbroken because the wolf was gone. So when you're talking about dogs or cats, or even a dog and a cat, don't assume they're just separate items. They may actually have to go as a bundle depending on what kind of feedback you get. And for younger or newer mediators who may not know yet how to bring these issues up, probably the worst thing in the world would be to just blurt out, well, why don't you each claim 1 or something like that? You got to be really sensitive to going the other way.
Okay, before I move on to the next issue, which is really just related to what we're talking about, someone has asked, how can they access the materials that were referenced? And when you received your invitation from Zoom, it should have had a link in it to Dropbox. And that's where you'll find them. Click on the link to Dropbox, and you'll find a zip file, and everything we're talking about is in that file. So what we're talking a little bit about is time sharing issues. So what other time sharing issues are involved when you're mediating a pet matter?
When we say time sharing issues, you mean a schedule? Again, we're assuming that people don't have children and they have a dog. I think most often when we have people in mediation, we move people to a more cooperative place all around, and that will include what to do with the time sharing of the child/pet dog. And I think people will usually do what they do when they have children, actual children. They'll look at each of their schedules. Well, yeah, I work late Monday and Tuesday. The dog has to be walked at 5:30, and they'll work out a schedule. Sounds just like the schedule people work out when they're picking kids up, from school or daycare or aftercare. Same idea. It becomes, when you do it, the more you do it, the more you realize how equivalent it can become, in fact.
How many cases have you done? How many mediations involving pets, Ken? Just a rough order of magnitude.
Certainly way more than a dozen.
Okay. Larry?
I've had over a dozen too. In fact, I just got on an arbitration yesterday. I just got a letter on an email on a pet-related issue. So it comes up. It just comes up. Sometimes you don't even expect it to come up, and it comes up in lots of different contexts. It comes up when you have, for example, an older dog, and there's an issue as to let's say the parties have a disagreement as to what's going to happen to that older dog. It's not necessarily a custody fight, but for health care. For a younger dog, you might see disputes over breeding rights and things like that. In other words, they're going to be puppies. Let's say it comes from a strong line, a blue ribbon line or something. Who gets the puppies? That kind of thing. And so there are all kinds of issues that come about from this. And then as I think Ken's going to mention, when you have a child involved, sometimes there's a child custody dispute. Sometimes the relationship to a dog, one or both parties tries to make a factor in the child custody dispute for a lot of different reasons. So there are lots of different ways these types of issues come up and do come up.
Right, Steve.
I've had as far as matters with pets as issues, there would be thousands. As far as matters with pets, predominantly, I'd say probably closer to 100. But oftentimes in the mediations that we have, pets are part of the picture. And as far as the pets and the pet sharing, one thing that sometimes we see is where you have a situation where either because one of the children might the parents may decide that the child will be spending the time predominantly with one parent as opposed to the other, with the other children having a shared parenting time, whether it's because of illness, whether it's because of psychological issues. There are also the pets can also take on a relevance. I think we're going to be talking about it later as far as emotional support for a child or for children. So because mediators are likely to have thousands of cases involving pets, even if it's not on point tangentially, this is something that I think we need to be ready for, and ready for some of the nuances that you'll be hearing about within this hour.
So moving on, now we're going to talk about emotional support animals. What is an emotional support animal? I'll just throw it open to you.
Emotional support animals is kind of a sort of a relatively new development or new term. We always used to think of service animals as being support animals. For example, if someone was vision impaired, was blind, you'd have a seeing eye dog who was trained, who was licensed to assist, a person with a disability who had a challenge. So emotional support animal is different because, first of all, any animal could theoretically be an emotional support animal. It's an emotional support animal. It's not trained. It doesn't have to be trained in any fashion. There's no license for that. A lot of the cottage industry has come about online where you can get a certificate that says your animal is an emotional support animal for $30 or something like that. So your only qualification is if your credit card clears, then in fact your animal will be qualified. But the point is that it really focuses on the human as opposed to the animal. The human needs to have the animal close to them at all times for emotional support, whether it reaches a level of psychological nature or otherwise. Many people just feel a comfort level when they have an animal next to them. So, for example, in several states, there are provisions and cases where somebody, when they take the stand as a witness, that they can have their emotional support animal sitting next to them, really on the witness stand. There's a whole big issue in the state of Washington where this had come about. And so An emotional support animal is really any animal which is designated to lend support to a human. So you may see this a mediator may see this in the context of a pet dispute in the future, because it's becoming such a huge issue for a lot of different reasons. There are a lot of different legal nuances and issues which stem separate from family court in terms of an emotional support animal. Are you allowed to bring an animal on a plane? Are you allowed to bring an animal into an apartment which otherwise does not allow pets? Is it discrimination if you allow or don't allow? What about the person who's allergic to your emotional support animal that you're sitting next to on the plane or the train? Which lawsuit do you want? That kind of thing. And so there are all kinds of issues which come from that, but you're certainly going to see this come about in family court issues in terms of one party or the other who perhaps wants the animal full time and doesn't want to share with the other side. This is my emotional support animal. My counselor says I need this animal as my emotional support animal. So you have to be aware of what an emotional support animal really is and is not. It does not require a whole lot of verification, quite frankly. It's not like a service animal where there's a whole training program and an animal is certified. And so a mediator has to be careful about that. You don't want to in any way diminish anyone's emotional support needs. But on the other hand, the other party may also have a strong emotional attachment to the animal. And it's very possible that a couple may each have an emotional support need to be close to the dog or cat, as the case may be, which may be why it's in mediation in the first place.
So have any of you ever had an emotional support animal brought into a mediation session?
I certainly have. This couple comes in. They didn't ask if it was okay, but because they don't have to ask, perhaps. But I was surprised that one of them brought their emotional support animal, and it became, they didn't have children, and it became the whole focus of the mediation was that animal and what would happen with it in terms of custody, if you will, because the other parent was also attached to the animal, but the person who brought the animal was trying to show me and make the point of how important that was. But there are also something we should also talk about, which is costs associated with animals. And most of the time, I always bring that up when people have an animal, and their costs go into different categories. There's ongoing costs of food. I mean, you could think of that as child support for food, but shelter, clothing. Not a lot of clothing for dogs, though. No, I shouldn't say that. There are vast clothing lines. You see very fancy outfits for dogs these days, of course. But food, but more importantly is vet bills, regular vet bills. And then there's really end of life, catastrophic, the one you started with, Carl, the $40,000 surgery. And I think we have to, and the reason we bring this up as mediators is to avoid, as we do with everything, avoid problems later. And when people agree to this, to say, okay, agreed upon medical costs, I don't know if you want to say that, but yeah, of course, agreed upon vet costs, medicine. There's also medicine, Carl, not just surgery. We've extended the lives of our household pets the same way we've extended people's lives, basically with the same medications. Dogs take the same medications people take for heart problems and the like, blood pressure and the like, same medications, and we've extended the life of pets. So when I was growing up, you'd think of 13 as the age that dogs live till typically. Now dogs living till 17, 18 is not rare. And of course, smaller breeds tend to live longer than larger breeds. But yeah, we've extended the life of dogs, but these things are expensive. And I think you have to have people talk about that in the mediation. I would always include that. That's very important.
Steve, you use a budget approach, right? You use a line item approach?
I do. I know many professional mediators have in the budget several categories. I specifically go over all of the specific items that may apply. As Ken had mentioned, first of all, you have pet food and pet supplies. Now, with respect to those in the budget, it's important to make sure that you're not doubling up on those expenses. So if someone purchases the pet food or the pet supplies when they go for the weekly shop at the store, you want to confirm that, and you want to make sure that those expenses are being included. Oftentimes, they are not included in the food at home and household supplies, in which case we need to go over each of these items separately so that we don't either end up double counting them or end up not counting them at all because somebody wasn't thinking to include that in there. So we need to make sure that it's being counted once, and it's being counted for all of the expenses. Now that would be for pet food. As far as pet supplies, they can take a number of different forms. There could be chew toys, there could be non-chew, non-edible toys, there could be treats, there could be other types of supplies. And again, we want to confirm whether those are being treated separately under an existing category or whether we need to make sure to account for them individually. Aside from pet food and supplies, you also have grooming expenses. Those can get expensive, especially if either you have multiple pets or you have the pet groomed relatively frequently. And so another issue needs to be how grooming expenses will be dealt with and or apportioned or otherwise dealt with between the spouses.
And also,
Another
also
financial,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Another financial expense associated with that is boarding. Sometimes people will have the pets groomed while they're boarded, so they don't have to take the pet back to the boarding center again for separate grooming. And boarding is another expense, which depending upon the number of pets you have, frequency, length of stay, all of that, I've seen range between $35, $35 for an overnight stay to $75 plus per day or per 24-hour period, depending upon what is happening with respect to the boarding. Now, another consideration associated with boarding and with expenses specifically might be if you have multiple pets, even though you might have a couple where they might say, I'll take this pet, I'll be responsible for this pet for boarding, the other one will be responsible for another pet. They may be able to actually save money as a couple by arranging for the pets to be multiply groomed and or multiply boarded under the same reservation and get a discount, much the way they would with an automobile insurance discount if you have more than one vehicle under the policy. So those are some of the considerations as far as grooming and boarding. And that as you had mentioned, Ken, there are a number of other discrete expenses associated with the health of the pets. It could include wellness visits, could include vaccinations, and actually there's a tie-in in vaccinations between the boarding and the pet vaccinations, in that the boarding facility will also oftentimes want to ensure that the pets are current and up to date on their vaccinations, or they won't accept the pet. And it might create an issue if someone's about to leave and needs to have the pet boarded and hasn't inquired into that. So, and there's the cost associated with vaccinations as well. You also have vitamins and supplements, whether they're prescribed or whether they are purchased at the pet store or in the major grocery store. And again, want to parse out to make sure that these expenses are being counted, but not being double counted. And then as far as veterinary care, you may have issues between acute situations where there might be a huge expense. It might just be for a certain issue that the pet is facing, but it could easily run into the thousands of dollars. And I've seen it run into multiple thousands of dollars depending upon what the issue is. Or you could have chronic expenses. With the chronic, at least the couple are aware of them in advance and can plan for them. But with the acute, you still want to address before those issues take place. How do the two of you want to address these types of expenses, whether they happened or didn't happen?
So,
Finally, as far as apportioning them, how do they want to apportion them? Just like with the support and other issues, when do the contributions, if there are contributions, start? When do they end? And those are some of the basic expenses associated with pets that our clients would want to consider.
So let's say that they have a plan and the pet gets cancer. And the recommended course of treatment is chemotherapy and radiation, and it's going to cost $10,000 to $15,000. And one party says, there's no way I'm going to spend that kind of money. I mean, are those the kinds of things you would actually address in a MOU? Or would you put some sort of formula into the MOU for future, or what happens?
Excellent question, Carl. How it's addressed, I think it depends upon the couple and the importance that these issues may involve in their lives and in the families and the pets' lives. I would probably start with a broader, open-ended question, whether they've considered those types of expenses, and if so, how would they like to deal with it, and to what extent and how specific would they like the agreement to be with respect to that. And that also oftentimes leads to follow-up questions. Well, what are the options? What are you talking about? Which is when I can say, well, there could be acute care issues that come up that could be significant. There could be chronic care issues. Some of them you might be dealing with now, and how they would like to have those addressed. And they may decide not to address them specifically at that time, but then I would ask, well, how would you like to consider addressing them if they do come up, if you're not addressing them specifically now? And they may say, especially with respect to the question that you just posed, Carl, with certain expenses, if it's a pet expense that exceeds X amount of dollars, they will need to come to an agreement at that time. If the expense doesn't exceed X amount, then perhaps whichever parent of the pet happens to have the pet at the time might advance the cost or pay for the cost. And if they're advancing it, then being reimbursed by the other. And the same with other expenses. If it's going to be reimbursed, within what period of time, how would it be reimbursed, how much, etc. But that's generally how I would address that, going from the more general and then being guided by the parties' desires based upon the follow-up questions.
Have any of you had a relocation issue with respect to a pet? The parents, one of the parties is relocating. Have you ever addressed that in an MOU?
I had an almost one, but we resolved it. A person wound up not moving, as it turned out. But no, that's very interesting. I don't cover relocation issues, as we do in every agreement with their children. I haven't thought of it, but thank you, Carl. I'll put that on my list. It's good to know that, because if there's children, then the relocation issue is covered under children. It's only if there are no children. But an issue that was the most difficult in all of my pet mediation issues, and most of the time people have pets, it's not an issue. But this one was, they had no children, and they agreed that if one of them couldn't be with their dog, a Bichon, that the other would be given first right of refusal, as we've come to call it. But sometimes neither of them could be available because of their work, travel, etc. And they had to agree on a list of providers of care, not boarding, not that, but individuals who would take care of the pet I forget the name, but I can look it up if you want. And they had to. It was a person's name.
It wasn't Fluffy.
Anyway, it was not Fluffy.
Okay.
No, no more Fluffy, no more Fluffies. So they had to. They really spent a lot of time talking about who could watch the dog when one of them couldn't. This was we spent more than 1 hour on this for sure, and the story has an unhappy ending, unfortunately, because they agreed that the wife's mother would not be suitable for that to happen. And then sure enough, the wife left, not sure enough, but the wife left the dog with her mother, and the dog was hit by a car. And so that, in fact, that was a very sad ending. But the agreement said that she was not a provider, a mandated provider. No, she was not on the list of people who could be with the dog. But unfortunately, that, I don't know what the period of time was, but I heard later from the husband that that's what happened. So yeah, there are some outcomes, that are sad. But certainly, I think we covered this almost with dogs when there were no children, particularly, almost with as much thoroughness as we would with children, up to a point, obviously. But as Steve was saying, yes, expenses up to, it's like orthodontics. I guess orthodontics for dogs. I don't know, but in fact, we covered these things with some thoroughness. I think more often than not. And Steve is right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carl, if I could just
Larry.
also add in the removal question you asked, it's an interesting question because it raises another important point that I think mediators need to be aware of. There are going to be times when people reach an agreement in terms of, who's time sharing with a dog or cat. And let's say they've worked it out, or they're all consensually, everyone's fine with it. But then, a year later or 2 years later, someone's moving on with their life and they are geographically moving far away. So now you have suddenly this removal issue concerning the pet. Now you say, well, okay, a family court may not get involved with that type of issue, especially if it doesn't relate to a child. However, separate from the family court, you have the law division. And if the title of the dog is in one party's name or not, that could have a major impact on who that dog's going to go with, if we're talking about a dog, if one party and the other party are living 1,000 miles away. This is why it's so significant when you're mediating these cases to have in your agreement, at least to consider having the agreement, regardless of who is the named title owner of the dog as registered with the municipality, that both are the owners, are the equitable owners of the animal. So that way their rights are a little more equal if and when there comes to be a dispute down the line. If all you do is put in the agreement in your MOU, well, they're going to timeshare the dog or cat this way, but one or the other was the titled owner simply because they just picked one to register the name and during the marriage, as many people do, there could be a major consequence to that potentially down the line. So you always have to, you always have to think of that a few steps ahead. A couple of other things and follow up to what Steve was talking about, some other provisions you might want to at least mention to the parties so that, and depending on how involved they are, they may want to include these in the agreement or not. Number one, there are pet insurance policies out there for health insurance. So it may make sense to at least suggest that they look into the cost. If it's something which is reasonable, maybe they split the cost in some fashion on a prorated basis. That may reduce vet bills if it's an older dog in particular, because older dogs tend to be more expensive in terms of their health care. The surgery cap, I agree completely with Steve in terms of suggesting perhaps that by way of example, that other couples have resolved these issues in advance by saying, okay, if the expenses are up to X dollars, let's say there's surgery which is needed and it's recommended by the vet not to exceed $2,000 or something like that, just picking a number, and divided 50-50 or in accordance with their respective incomes. If it goes over that and one wants to have the surgery, then it would be on their dime unless they both agree. I think you want to perhaps have an agreement on who the veterinarian is, because just like in child custody disputes and people are debating who the pediatrician is, if people treat their dog as their child, they may have a completely different view on who the vet should be or try to get different opinions from different vets. Whoever it is, they should go to the vet to get opinions in terms of whether or not there should be surgery or not. And I don't think a vet is just going to automatically say have the surgery. Vets deal all the time with with, you know, basically in a compassionate way, putting animals out of their misery, so to speak, if they're suffering. This is part of being a veterinarian. So those discussions are had in intact families. So to try to incorporate that, at least suggest it as a possibility in the course of a mediation, where in a sensitive way may make some sense. You also, I think, want to consider having a provision that neither party can put down the animal or give away the animal without the other party's consent, because sometimes this will happen, especially if there's bad blood between the parties. If one party's more attached to the animal than the other party just wants to be spiteful or get back at them for some reason. Next thing you know, they gave the dog away, or they put the dog down without telling the other side. And there's not a whole lot of recourse. I mean, you could try some legal things, but it's a lot more difficult situation when you're dealing with an animal, especially if the person who put the animal down is the only named owner. And then lastly, in terms of registry, I'm sorry.
These are a lot of details. So the couple walks in, or they zoom in, and they're not talking about animals at all.
Right.
They're not. Are you going to raise this and an all? No. This is only.
This is for your own knowledge in your head as a mediator.
Okay. This is when they raise it.
Yeah.
And then you're helping them think through details.
Right. Right. If you start bringing all this up and they haven't, they may not look at the dog in any way, in any significant way, and they may think, why are you telling us all this stuff? It's not even an issue for us. But if you have a couple who are very, very into their dog and they're treating it like a child, these are the types of issues a mediator has to have, I think, in the back of their mind that may come up in the context of the discussions, and to be prepared for it.
Okay.
If a couple comes in and doesn't say anything about pets at all, I still inquire about pets, because they might not even think that it's a relevant subject to be addressed or mediated. And then once that's addressed, then you get the floodgate of questions. Well, how about this and what about that? So yeah, I don't go into specifics about veterinary care or about pet insurance without, obviously first checking. But if they come to me and there is no mention at all of a pet, I still, in every single situation, inquire about it, because invariably, I'd say about 60 to 65% of the couples that come in, maybe as many as 70, do have pets, and they just don't even think to raise it. When look at all of these considerations that they would have lost out on if the mediator hadn't asked that one single question at the beginning.
And Carl, in the cases,
is there any such thing as a premarital?
I would always ask. I always ask, do you have premarital pet? Yeah. I always ask, do you have any pets? And if they say yes, it's not a problem, I'll certainly drop it. And if I ask if they have pets, and I say, what do you have? And they say, and usually for most people, they say, yeah, we've taken care of that. It's not a problem. And I won't, you won't do that with children. Oh yes, we have children, but nothing to talk about. No, of course, we wouldn't do that with children, but we will do that with pets. That's a big difference.
Okay. No, I was not being entirely facetious when I said a premarital pet.
No, not at all. That's a very big issue.
The husband has had this pet for 2 years, had it 2 years before they got married. They've now been married 8 years. Is that a commingled pet? Or does it stay premarital property? Any idea?
Yeah, it depends, of course, is always the answer. I think it becomes, I think there's a time, if the person had the pet for 8 years and now they're married 6 months, that's one thing. I think common sense would say, yes, has that person become attached to the pet? If the person has become attached to the pet to them, obviously, it's one thing. The other person generally recognizes that.
Right.
I don't think you're going to litigate the issue of premarital pet. No.
Okay, here's another question. How would you differentiate between pets and farm animals? Some could be revenue generating, others defined as pets. How would you declare that a farm animal is a pet? A horse, I don't know, a pig, a goat?
A pig?
No. Any thoughts?
I
haven't had that yet.
Yeah,
no thoughts yet.
I think it's a legitimate question.
Yeah.
You may have animals. For example, if you're in a rural community, and a horse could easily be treated as a pet. I mean, in fact, emotional support animals sometimes even include horses. And so it's you could have an animal that takes on both characteristics. If you're just talking about an animal that, like chickens that you're raising on a farm and are not treated in any domesticated fashion, that's going to more likely to not be treated as property, just as anything else on the farm would be. If you're talking about, you know, a horse or even another type of animal, it could be a goat. Lots of people get pigs as pets, for example, and treat them almost as dogs. And pigs are very smart. I'm not saying that you're going to start having custody litigation over a pig, but some of the issues in the context of mediation in these types of situations may be the same for those types of animals, depending on the circumstances, as it would be in a more typical dog and cat situation. So it really depends on what the animal's role was in the context of the house.
All things to be discussed, right? If the parties want to discuss them, there are things to be discussed. The next issue that we said we'd talk about is pet as property of the child of the separating or divorcing parents.
Well, I think that's generally the case. I think when people have children, particularly younger children, not a child going off to college who isn't going to take the pet most likely, I think the tendency most parents have, as I said earlier, is the pet, the dog, for example, goes with the child. A cat less so. You don't have to walk a cat typically, but the dog goes with the children, I think, is most typically the case. It's not the possession of the child, but it goes with the child. I think that's how. I think Steve, Larry, most people I think assume that. Well, and you know, there's going to be an odd case here or there, but mostly I think we see that happening, and there's no conflict about it, you know, really.
Well, yeah, no, in general, I think you're right. Although there can be complications in blended families where, let's say, only some of the children are going for parenting time, but the dog belongs to all of the children. So you could have an issue there. You could have an issue if a child has an allergy or an alleged allergy to a dog or a cat, as the case may be. Sometimes you have that situation comes up. But in general, in a very binary situation where it's just, you know, one child, for example, or children all from the same marriage and one pet, yes, the pet would go back and forth. But a lot of times after the couple is separated, they each already have their own new pets, and then they just have a pet at each house. So again, you have to look at the situation. But from a mediator standpoint, one thing you could suggest is the pet, obviously it's going with the animal unless the parties agree to the contrary. I mean, if the child has a lot of parent back and forth, you don't want to necessarily be packing up the dog every other day to follow the child. You don't necessarily need to do that. But so long as there is ample time for the child to be with the dog in both households.
Okay.
And it's also very family specific.
Right.
What was the role of the pet before? Was
Right.
the pet primarily the child's or the child's responsibility? Or was it a situation where the pet was primarily the pet of one parent who basically took care of the pet, and the child didn't have any responsibilities, you know, didn't care for the pet? So I think a lot of it depends upon what the family history is associated with the pet, at least as a starting point for what role do they want the pet to play in the new family dynamic.
But it's not uncommon to see in a custody dispute, all of a sudden one parent goes out and buys a pet for the child. You see that happen quite a bit, actually.
That's when they had no pet previously, most
Yeah,
typically.
right. Yeah.
Okay, Larry, here's one for you about domestic violence and pet abuse.
Okay. Attached in the materials is also a case. It's an unreported case, but it was I believe it's on the judiciary website, SS versus ST. And it was the issue was, can abuse of an animal result in a domestic violence restraining order? It was my case. And I ruled in the context of that case that it can, and it did. And I did issue a restraining order, not because someone was abusive to the animal per se, that's animal abuse, but that's not domestic violence, because domestic violence protects people. But in that particular case, the facts demonstrated that the abuser was abusing the dog specifically to harass the victim of domestic violence. It did it in her presence. She was a dog lover. He did it right in front of her. He knew that she was very sensitive around dogs, or towards dogs, and he starts beating the dog, kicking the dog very violently in front of her. So he doesn't touch her. So she gets a restraining order. She gets a TRO, and one of the attempted defenses was, well, no, that's abuse of an animal. It's not abuse of an adult. It resulted in a final restraining order. There were other issues in that case too. If you have time, I would recommend you read the case because it also cites a lot of the cases we talked about earlier, the Hausman case, the Hyland case, the statutory developments in animal law, which even if outside the context of domestic violence, it's good information to have as a mediator. You can't mediate generally domestic violence, but you can mediate other issues if there's no restraining order in place.
Okay, Steve, mediation versus arbitration. Have you done arbitration on cases on pets, or?
I can count them in one hand
Okay.
over the last 4 decades. Basically, typically the majority of matters that I resolve are through mediation. But just as you would have issues with and questions with other types of issues, you would have the same ones with a pet. If the couple cannot reach an agreement with respect to the pet in mediation, and I find it's much more likely that they would reach an agreement with respect to the pets in mediation than might be the case with certain other issues, whether they're financial or trial related. You always have the option of arbitration as well. Arbitration being a situation where a third party, an impartial third party, makes a decision for the spouses as to what the disposition should be as to the pet, the custody of the pet, or the financial issues associated with the pet, if it cannot be resolved in mediation. And some couples prefer, if it's going to be a contentious situation and it's not resolved through mediation, and it may go to arbitration, you have the same options that you do with other types of issues, including MEDARB, which is a hybrid mediation arbitration situation where they generally would agree on the individual to address the issues in arbitration if they are unable to come to an arrangement mutually through mediation. It's far more unusual, but in situations where the pet takes on a tremendous amount of importance in that particular situation, where MEDARB or arbitration might be addressed by the parties.
Okay, and one final question. This was submitted in writing to me in advance, and it's about Fluffy. So the question is, obviously this is quoting the clients. We share time with the dog Fluffy, but my ex-wife does not want my new girlfriend near Fluffy. Does she have that right? Our divorce agreement remains silent about introducing Fluffy to new partners. Now, I'm presuming this is a real question. So,
well, we talked about this a little bit before. Of course, the divorce agreement was silent on this issue. It would be hard to imagine otherwise. We certainly talk about that with children. We don't usually with pets for the obvious reason. I think we would generally take the point of view, we can't start doing that. We can't start listing. But in the case that I referenced before, it was who would take care of the dog if one of them couldn't and the other one wasn't available. This is different. I can understand people being upset that Fluffy is now in the presence of someone's new romantic partner, but I don't think we can do anything about that unless Steve or Larry thinks there's a way we can. I guess you could talk about it beforehand, but it seems.
You could try to in advance if that's an issue which is brought up by one party or the other in mediation in advance, like a what if. I suppose you could try to work out parameters. If they both agree on some kind of restrictions, then fine. If they don't, or if it doesn't come up at all, I think the only way that would really carry a lot of weight is if there was something specific about the specific person that made them a danger around an animal. For example, they had a documented history of animal abuse. They had a history of let's say, had charges against them, with convictions, I should say. But short of that, I think it's going to be very tough to try to enforce those types of restrictions. Those are difficult enough cases with children. When you try to keep a new boyfriend or girlfriend away from a child, there are restrictions on that to some degree. But at least there's a best interest analysis. You're not going to do a best interest analysis of an animal in all likelihood, given the status of the law. as it exists now. And it would be very difficult to prove too.
You know, just the fact, Carl, that that question came up is reason for all of us mediators to realize that these types of issues may take on much greater importance in the lives of the people who
Right.
come before us to help them mediate these issues, and that we need to be sensitive to that, even if that isn't something that we have dealt with or normally do deal with, because they will come up and they will continue to come up. So I'm glad that you raised that, just for the sake of making mediators aware of the wide range of issues regarding pets that can be presented, and the importance of our being sensitive to things that might be beyond what we normally might be considering.
Right. That's the number one. That's the number one takeaway point, in my opinion, from all of this, which is for a mediator, particularly a new mediator, which is to have a heightened sensitivity on these issues, regardless of what your personal feelings may be one way or the other on the issue.
Well, I want to thank all of you for today's program. And I
Thank
want
you.
to assure everyone that I'm going to go tell our cat that she can have our annual physical, even though I'm not even told what
How
it
much will that cost, Carl? How
I
much will
don't
it-
want to know. Please don't tell me. And so thanks a lot. And
Thank you. Thank you
we'll
for
see
having
you
me.
at
It
the
was
next webinar, which is, by the way, a week from today. And it's a new series called Tech Time with Lawrence and Carl. So we're going to be talking about how to give your best appearance during Zoom mediations and other Zoom calls. So
Carl, if someone has a question about the code to receive credit for this, caller, is there?
no, there are no credits for either of these.
Okay.
Not yet, but stay tuned, because Larry and I are putting on a series of 7 webinars starting in October that will have CLEs.
With multiple different speakers,
Yes,
not just us.
multiple speakers.
And so
Exactly.
attorneys will be able to get CLE credits, and we're excited about that.
Yeah, look for news that fairly soon. So thanks again. It was really very good. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
care.
Thanks for having us. Take care. Good luck.
As always, guys. Bye.
Bye. Stay safe.